Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tenser, CEO of SpyderWorks, a leading business consultancy for mid-market organizations and entrepreneurs globally. With me today is Sarah Kaplan, professor and director of the Institute for Gender and the Economy at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. She is the author of the business bestseller Creative Destruction, and more recently, the 360-Degree Corporation, from stakeholder trade-offs to transformation. Like this video if you enjoy our show, and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Sarah Kaplan, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Oh, my pleasure to be here.
So Sarah, let's start with an award. And I believe it was quite recent, the Simmons Award for Advancing Women in Leadership. Can you tell us about the award and what led up to it?
Well, it was obviously quite an honor to receive an award. This particular one is offered to a management scholar who's making a contribution to advancing women in leadership. And mine, I believe, was in recognition of the work that I've done in founding the Institute for Gender and the Economy 6 years ago, and how I've sort of used the work of the Institute to help make headway in all sorts of issues around gender equality, but specifically in understanding and thinking about solutions to barriers to women's advancing to leadership positions, but also even just their economic inclusion all along the way. And so that's a mission of the Institute, is to kind of bust the myths that are holding progress back and make an attempt to change how policymakers think, how organizational leaders think, so that they can actually change their policies and make organizations more receptive to the advancement of women.
So first, congratulations. And secondly, you mentioned something very specific there about busting myths. What myths are commonly held, and what can we do about it?
Well, that's a conversation that could take a long time, but let me tell you that that was one of the things that inspired me to, when I set up the Institute for Gender and the Economy, or our acronym is GATE, so we call ourselves GATE, was because I looked around. This was in 2016. It was in the middle of the US election, before we knew the outcome, but you didn't have to be very sensitive to issues around discrimination to just see how much misogyny was directed at Hillary Clinton. And whatever you think about her, I think it's true to say that had happened. And it was exactly 30 years after I had graduated university. And at that time in 1986, people had said, you're the generation that's benefited from the women's liberation movement. You're going to be able to achieve anything you want to achieve. And just that the world is your oyster. And I woke up 30 years later and realized we hadn't made that much progress. And the stats, bear that out, that there has been sort of a plateauing of the progress that women have been able to make in terms of their economic inclusion. And I started looking at what was happening both in public policy as well as organizational policy, and realized that a lot of the activities were based on some myths that turn out to, if you research into understanding what's really going on, these things are not true. For example, women are more risk averse, and therefore they don't put their hat in the ring for promotional jobs, or they don't apply for jobs that would help them earn more money, or they don't start entrepreneurial ventures because they're more risk averse. Well, the research really does not show that. The research shows that women are no more or less risk averse than men. But in fact, what is the case, and how we bust that myth, is by talking about the structures that surround that. So it is just riskier for a woman to put her hat in the ring for a job, because we know, because of discrimination in organizations, she's going to be much less likely to get the job. And to start an entrepreneurial venture in a world where only 6% of venture money goes to women-led businesses, it is just that much riskier. So in fact, for the exact same behavior, women are actually taking more risk than men, but it gets framed as women being risk averse. And that's an example of something that I think is then leading to some really outdated policies like, oh, well, let's train women to negotiate better, or what, let's help them build their confidence or whatever, when the actual answer is going to be something more structural, something that is going to help us make organizations more inclusive, so that it isn't as risky for women to undertake these activities. So that's one example, but I can go through many others. But the goal of the Institute and the goal of my own work in communicating research ideas is to take these myths that I think are holding us back and explain why they're a myth, show what the rigorous research says, and then come up with solutions that address what the real problems are.
And how do you take the learning that you have and help to bring it out there, whether it's to policymakers, whether it's to CEOs or board directors? I mean, because that to me, it's one thing recognizing, but actually bringing about change must be monumental.
It is, and it's very slow, and it can be very frustrating. And I always say that the reason I founded the Institute was because I'm just so incandescently angry all the time about the inequalities that still exist, but I want to turn that anger into hope. And so I continue to do this work. What we specifically do is, first of all, I'm based in the University of Toronto, the Rotman School of Management. So we do a lot with our students, whether it's through courses, case competitions, through events, everything we can do to get students engaged, because of course they're the future leaders and they need to be in these conversations. But second, we also do a lot of policy work. So we put out policy reports that take the scholarly research, interpret it, and apply it to particular questions, whether it was for the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan for Canada, whether it's our recent policy report on the care economy and care work. So we put out reports, and then we also do a lot of media and as much engagement with policymakers as we can. So for example, next week, I'm actually testifying in front of a Canadian Senate committee about what they're doing in terms of gender-based analysis in their policies. So as much as we can do to engage with policymakers, we do. And then of course, engaging with executives, whether that's by publishing articles in journals that executives read, whether it's by engaging with them in speaking engagements, or we do a lot of research that actually requires us to be inside organizations running research within them. And so we engage with a lot of companies on doing experiments on ways that we can make improvements. And so those are all the different ways that we try to get people in the conversation.
And those people, because I know your background goes from Wharton to MIT, now to Rotman. Is there a different receptivity in different countries, different parts of the world? Like, is this common? Like, because I don't know exactly how broad GATE works. And I know, I mean, I'm in Toronto, so I know Rotman very well, and it has an incredible international platform. Where does GATE lie in terms of Canada versus an international conversation?
Yeah, well, obviously we're Canadian based. And so our first priority is to think about how we influence the Canadian economy and Canadian corporate life and Canadian entrepreneurship and all those things. However, we do interact with scholars around the world and policymakers around the world and corporates around the world. And so we are, I mean, GATE is only 6 years old, so we're compared to some research centers that focus on these issues, we're just starting, but we have an audience that's global, and these issues really do resonate almost anywhere you look. We have a course on Coursera on gender analytics, and we have over 12,000 people who've registered from that course, and they're literally from all over the world, every country of the world, every corner of the world. We have people who are engaging in these questions. So yes, there are clearly cultural differences. We know some countries are more gender inclusive than others, but these issues resonate everywhere.
I started my undergrad in 1983 and my master's in 1990. And for fun, in 2021, I went back for my doctorate. I have seen and I also get to teach. So I've seen a lot of students around the world. I've seen an incredible change in the makeup of the classrooms, undergrad and graduate, in diversity, not just gender diversity, but racial diversity, age diversity. To me, if we can get to the root and get students from school to high school to college or university, whatever it is that they're interested in, if we can build the diversity at the root, to me, that seems to be a good, at least beginning of the pathway.
Well, it's absolutely true that, when we talk about why are there no women in senior leadership roles, or so few women CEOs or women on boards or things. As an example, you could also say the same thing for so few leaders who are Black or Indigenous. Um, you could say part of the problem is the quote pipeline problem, which you're alluding to, which is, boy, if we could just get more people into, more women and people of color into the MBA, then we would solve the problem. And it is true that we do have a system that has historically channeled women and people of color away from some of the high paying sectors, STEM fields, management, things like that. But at the same time, even for those who are coming through, they are greeted by jobs and organizations that are not welcoming them and making those jobs harder for them and not giving them the opportunities to advance. So yes, I agree, we can help all along the pipeline from education all the way through. But even if we did, I mean, we know, for example, in medicine that more women than men graduate from med school, and same thing with law, more women than men have graduated from law school, and this has been for many years. And yet you look at the top of the law firms or the top of hospitals or things like that, it's still all men. So just getting the pipeline of education fixed without fixing the structures inside organizations that lead women or people of color to be shunted away from the advancement opportunities, it's not going to solve the problem.
So where within organizations then do we start? And I ask that because I have three children, three stepchildren, so six. My daughters, all of them have such a different approach to the world, being in med school, being in what have you, very accomplished already, to what they believe they can do. So there's a structure. Then you're saying the pipeline, once you're inside the larger institutional structure, where do we start within an organization or within the field of medicine to help to help the next gen breakthrough as well as people working today?
Right, exactly. And I think one of the things that we're seeing as we're fixing the education system more is that women and other marginalized groups get into the world of employment thinking, oh, I'm going to have all these opportunities, and then discover that that world hasn't really changed yet. So one of the things that we focus on is applying an innovation lens to diversity and inclusion, thinking about how can we innovate in our organizational practices and design. So some examples of things, the research that people at Gate have done. One is something as simple and incremental as changing the wording in job ads. And we know from experiments we've run inside organizations that if you change the wording to remove some masculine gendered language or add even feminine gendered language, that you can actually change who applies. And often not because, like, if you take a male dominated job in finance for something, you don't get fewer male applicants when you do this, you just get more women applicants, and often more non-traditional men who may not also feel like they fit into the standard male stereotype also. So something as simple as that can really increase just who's entering your organization. And then you think about promotions. Some other research that our team has done has looked at changing how you think about promotions. In a lot of organizations, you have to kind of put your hat in the ring for a promotion. We call it opting in. You have to say, yes, I want to be considered for a promotion. And, because of the risk aversion issues that we were just talking about earlier, because it's so much riskier for women to do it, they may choose not to because they're like, I'm never going to get the job anyway. I don't want to have that disappointment. I don't want to, deal with, feeling like I was turned down for something. So they don't put their hat in the ring. If you simply change that so that in an organization, everyone at a certain level gets considered for the promotion and you get the option to opt out. So you still have the choice. I'm either opting in or opting out. You still can be considered or not be considered. And simply by turning it into an opt out from an opt in, you can actually erase the gender differences and who's considered for promotions. So those are just two kind of examples on how you can innovate and how you run your organization that can actually really change who gets considered to even enter and then who gets promoted. Then, of course, there's the experience that people have inside organizations. And one of the things we're really talking about, especially as the kind of tsunami that COVID was in organizational design, we're thinking about what is the future of work and what can organizations look like to be more inclusive and accommodating of people, so they're not constantly facing microaggressions or other slights and things like that. And so we're still experimenting and working on ideas about how to make organizations more inclusive, but it's not just enough to put a more diverse group of people in the organization if you don't change the work practices so that they actually, people thrive within those organizations. And so those are some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of how you can kind of innovate in your organizational design to, do the kinds of things that you were asking about.
It almost seems that because of the upheaval of the pandemic and moving to hybrid and hybrid cultures, and I don't even like the notion of the great resignation because we're systemically getting older in society. It almost seems like very good timing to say, if we're rethinking everything, here's the opportunity to make efforts like GATE really pay off.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Um, I was really moved in the beginning of the pandemic, the very beginning of the pandemic. Arundhati Roy, the famous author, wrote describing the pandemic as a portal, and a portal into a potentially new world. And I have taken that idea very seriously in thinking about how can we emerge from this with a better work, better organizations, better economy, better society. So that's why we wrote the Feminist Economic Recovery Plan for Canada, joint with YWCA Canada. And we actually have a report coming out in a couple of months looking at flexible work and what all the research has said about what makes flexible work or not. And given that so many organizations now are moving to hybrid or work from home or work from anywhere, the question is, how do we make that transition to a completely new way of working? How do we make that actually erase some of the inequalities and negative experiences that people have had in the past? How can we use this as the opportunity to design the future of work in a way that really is much more inclusive? So you're absolutely right. And we're trying to do as much as we can to influence both public policy and organizational policy on that front.
Are there one or two leading thoughts? I know that this is newish, obviously, because the pandemic is actually somewhat still here. But are there one or two sort of leading thoughts you can share on how we can leverage this?
Well, one thing that we're also focusing on is related to care work and childcare. And, what has happened is that some people really have appreciated the flexible work or work from home because it makes childcare or elder care or other those kinds of responsibilities easier. But it was when the pandemic hit and everyone had to be home, then it was more shared in terms of the work across, in case of heterosexual couples where you have a male and a female partner at home, it's more shared. What's happening now is, as organizations are often insisting that people come back to work, that it is often the male partner who is going back physically to work, and the woman who is staying at home because they still need all that flexibility, because of course the pandemic isn't even really over. And that's because of our gendered notions of who does care work at home. So one thing that organizations need to do is really think about their flexible work policies. Are they being used equally by people of all genders, so that we're not getting some low status? The low status people do the work from home, and the high status people are the one who can do the FaceTime in an organization. So making a policy universally appealing. The second thing is to pay attention to the fact that some people, especially, we've gotten some early research indicating that pregnant women, women and people of color in general, and other people have felt more comfortable at home because they experience many fewer microaggressions. There was a recent study that just came out that women just don't get asked to clean things up as much. Like when women are in the office, they were often, the microaggression they experienced was being expected to do the cleaning, clean up the kitchen or straighten up the copy machine or whatever it is, even senior women. And that doesn't happen when you're at home. So paying attention to the fact that home actually created an environment where some people were more comfortable and didn't have the experience of the negative impact of bias inside the organization. And so using that to learn about what can we do in an organization, whether people are working from home or working in the office, that reduces those negative impacts. So those are a couple of things that we're thinking about, but there are many, many others that will be coming out in our report in a couple of months.
Well, I look forward to that. And Sarah, here's a question I like to ask all of our guests, because our guests really, high is human ingenuity, clever, inventive, original thinking. The foundation to me is passion.
Mhm.
Why you? There are billions of people in the world, and you have such a passion to make a change. Where does that come from? What was the root of that?
Wow, that's a wonderful question, and I would say I am so angry about inequalities in our society, and I am in a position of incredible privilege. I'm a full tenured distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, leading, university in Canada. I almost feel like I have an obligation to be doing this work because I have had the privilege of education, the privilege of being white, the privilege of being a dual citizen in Canada and the US. Like I have a lot of privileges and I feel like I would be remiss if I weren't using them to fight the good fight. Um, and also just because I think the anger would destroy me if I weren't trying to do something with it, if I weren't trying to really change things. And so what drives me every day is the opportunity to really make a difference and to enable part of what we do at the Institute for Gender and the Economy is enable other researchers to follow their passions, to do the work that's actually I can't do it all myself. So I see most of my work
Mhm.
as enabling other people to do this work, to have these insights. And so the more that we can do, the more, I'm constantly trying to raise funds. All I do all the time is fundraise because I want to put more resources into this, enable more researchers, enable more organizations to do this work. And I just I feel I do feel called to do it. I was an innovation scholar by training. This work that I've done over the last 6 years is kind of a switch, but I really felt like what we know from the world of innovation and how hard it is and how much organizational change is required, all of these things, what we know from that can be translated into this world of creating a more equitable society. And we often don't think of it as an innovation challenge, but I like to. I like to think that what to solve these problems, it's not going to be little marginal things around the edge. It's going to be organizational transformations that require all the same skills that we use for innovation, and we should be applying it in this context. So that's what drives me.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing, and thank you for the candor. And just sort of switch a little bit now to your book, a best-selling. Well, you've got a number of books out, but focusing on the 360-degree corporation, about trade-offs and the C as a source of organizational resilience and transformation. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and what it can do for us as organizational leaders?
In addition to my work on gender, I've really been thinking more broadly about all the different ways that we can create a more equitable and just and sustainable society. And so I have for a number of years taught a course to the MBA students at the Rotman School called the 360 Corporation. Why 360 degrees? Because it's about looking at the corporation in its entirety with all of the stakeholders that surround it, whether it's employees, the environment, communities, in addition to the shareholders, which I think the business world over indexes on. And so, really thinking about what is the corporation in society, and some of the ideas that I was already talking about. And we can think of this as an innovation challenge. How can we use the challenges that come from thinking about the trade-offs that get created in businesses? Okay, so we want to grow, but maybe growth leads to more pollution. How do we deal with that trade-off? Can actually be a source of innovation because it's not obvious how to solve that problem. And so you've got to really innovate around it. How are we going to fight the climate crisis? Well, it's going to require a tremendous amount of innovation. How are we going to fight gender inequality? It's going to require a tremendous amount of innovation. And I designed the course and then ended up writing my book about this. Um, because I think most people in organizations have at least some good intentions about these issues, but don't know what to do. And I wanted to give people some very practical ideas of like, here's how to get started. There's no like simple answers. These are incredibly complicated, hard problems. But if you don't even know how to start, it can be problematic. And so I came up in the book and through my teaching with my students, this is really a model that emerged over years of engaging with my wonderful students here at Rotman. First thinking about really learning about what your trade-offs are, because a lot of organizations don't even understand that some of their operations may be harming communities or create water pollution, or, just not thinking beyond the bottom line. And then, once you've done that, thinking about, are there some obvious win-wins where you could just do something differently to benefit everyone? The problem is, I think a lot of organizations get stuck with the win-wins, and if they can't get a business case for it right away, they don't do it. And so what I do in the book is try to push people to say, look, just because you don't have a business case now doesn't mean there isn't a business case eventually, but you're going to have to really think much more boldly. You're going to have to take more risks. You're going to have to experiment, and you're going to have to think about transformational innovations that I believe will eventually pay off. But if you wait to have that perfect PowerPoint and the perfect spreadsheet with the business case, you'll never actually do it. And so this book is kind of a template for helping people get out of the simple business case mindset and thinking about these challenges as opportunities for innovation and transformation.
So when I listen to that, I think back, I ran a few sessions pre-pandemic with Matt Fulbrook at Rotman. It was about governance and innovation. And one of the challenges, and so again, pre-pandemic, and I think this is magnified now. One of the challenges is that boards and directors and leaders don't know where to start when it comes to innovation. I mean, as directors, yes, we get our packages, we get our pre-reading. Our discussions, though, can be very short and tight. And we're talking about some monumental changes, some monumental macro trends that are impacting us. So how do we get over this, and how do we deal with monumental decision making in an incredibly tight time frame?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I started thinking about that too, because I was not traditionally, I hadn't really thought about governance and board questions. I was really focused on the CEO, management, what leadership can do. But then I got together with Peter Day, and he and I, I written an op-ed in the Globe and Mail, and he wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail. We decided to get together and do a project where we thought about, what is governance for the 21st century? What is governance in the face of all these questions? And so we wrote a report that came out in 2021 called 360 Governance, related to the idea of the 360 Corporation, where we gave a roadmap for board directors. And quite frankly, it's just getting harder. Being a director of a company, the governance questions are just much harder because, in Canada, for sure, since there was a 2008 Supreme Court decision that basically said boards don't have to just consider the bottom line. They really can consider all of these different stakeholders, and these stakeholders are making their voices heard. So how a board takes into account the perspectives of different stakeholders is really important. How they take into account the upcoming requirements for climate disclosure, how they take into account diversity disclosure, how they take into account Indigenous rights. These are things that make the job of a director much more complicated. And that's one of the reasons Peter Day and I wrote our report, is to say, okay, here's at least a set of principles you can think about as you go through this process. But I believe it's going to require more investment on the part of boards to get up to speed and to maybe do more than what just comes in the board package, because the board package is provided by the company, and maybe you need to get some perspectives from other places to be able to deal with these questions. But that's why we need to have talented and diverse teams of people on boards to be able to make sure that they are exercising business judgment in a way that takes into consideration these various stakeholders.
So Sarah, it's gone very quickly, but our time is our time is coming to an end here today. But if you may, I have one last question, and it does go back to the 360 Corporation and to our continuation of the conversation. You talk about clicktivists, creating social media storms. I mean, on top of looking at everything from every perspective from the 360 degrees, we have no opportunity to make a mistake anymore. I mean, it's and we're so beautifully imperfect. Why can we not allow ourselves to have a misstep or a foible? And how do we deal with that as leaders?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because of course with social media, it's much easier to pick up on problems or missteps that companies make and critique them. And I think every company is going to be susceptible to that. However, I think that people are pretty smart, and they can get whether a mistake is a mistake that was made while an organization was trying to experiment with how to make a solution versus a mistake that was made because the organization wasn't paying attention and was thoughtless. People are more sophisticated. They can tell the difference. And if you look, for example, at Nike, this is an imperfect company, but working very hard on a lot of things. And you can look when Mark Parker was the CEO, he would write in the sustainability report, look, this analysis we're doing are, celebrating some of our successes, but also pointing out a whole bunch of our flaws and pointing out where we need to do better. And that level of honesty gives you the right to keep going, as opposed to a company that's hiding or isn't committed, isn't making the effort. And so I think that there's a lot more tolerance for mistakes that are made because you're experimenting with how to really make it work versus mistakes that are made because you have been inattentive to these important issues.
Well, thank you for that. And yes, I couldn't agree more. And it's about trying our best and being honest and open. And Sarah Kaplan, I just want to thank you for your candor today, for joining us on Say Hi to the Future. And thank you for the anger that has created passion and so much positive change.
Well, thank you. I hope to continue saying hi to the future in the future.
Okay, take care.